NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So I first have to thank Drew for allowing me to have the freedom of using y'all. And I don't have to hold back. I love to say y'all. I type it in my emails. So thank you. Before we get started, I want to kind of put us in the frame of activism. So can I ask, one, this is after lunch, and I don't want any dozing off. So I need everyone to stand, and we're going to do a quick call and response. I'll state what I want you to repeat, and then we'll bring it all together. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you. So this session, oh, by the way, I think Angela said Toni will be stepping up. My name is Roberta Meyers, and I work at the Legal Action Center, a nonprofit law and policy organization based in New York, Washington, D.C., and right here in Georgia where I live. This is my home. So happy that the conference is here this year. I didn't have to get on a plane to fly out. I have only missed one conference for NACDL and love it. The conference session is called The Road to Reentry, Navigating Systems Players and Building Coalitions. So we're going to be talking about some of the successes and the challenges that come with working together with those we identify as allies, but those folks that we might consider unlikely allies as we move forward. We have an amazing panel today, and I'm so excited. I told them to turn it up, so I've given everyone that permission. We have Mary Price, who's General Counsel at Families Against Mandatory Minimums, who we call lovingly FAMM, and you'll hear from her. Next, we have Ngozi Ndulue, and I was not going to mess up your name, I promise, who's the Senior Director of Criminal Justice Programs at the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. I wanted to say it to make sure for y'all don't know what it actually stands for. And we have my brother in this fight, who's been my teacher as well. I think we met in 2002 as well. But Dr. Devon Pryor has been my teacher in this fight as well, and he's the executive director of the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions. And so, as I said, I've given them free reign. We're gonna let it loose on this panel. So y'all loosen up. I'm having them to loosen up, and I want us to have a good dialogue going forward. So I mentioned what the panel title is, and in it had reentry. Now I know Dr. Pryor will eloquently argue that reentry doesn't apply to many of the people we are working to liberate because of the social construction of race and gender in the United States and the dichotomies that have been created between white, black, and brown people and men and women for the campaign to strengthen and promote the false narrative of the superiority of one race and one gender.
Yeah, I would say something like that.
Yep. I know who I'm on this panel with. For the discussion today, I want us to first acknowledge that no one working on criminal justice reform can do this work effectively and with integrity without considering how racism drives criminal justice policy and practice. If this is not part of the foundation of your work, then you are not really working to transform the system to work as it should. Second, you have to always consider who benefits from the current system. Third, although the criminal justice or penal system, as it should be called, is made up of only 3 components, law enforcement, courts, and corrections, the pipelines into it are created by a multitude of systems. This makes our work complex and difficult. Therefore, we all have to develop strategic alliances that will help us reach different audiences in order to bring about effective and meaningful change, especially with the issues that we need to address in terms of making sure people have access to education, voting, working, housing, health, etc. Each of the organizations represented on this panel will share their experiences with navigating the various systems we wish to influence and our efforts to build coalitions to fight for our people. There are some clear advantages to working in coalition. It enlarges your base of support, networks and connections, and gives strength in numbers, provides safety for advocacy efforts and protection for members who may not be able to take action alone, particularly when operating in a hostile or difficult environment, reduces the duplication of efforts and resources, enhances the credibility and influence of an advocacy campaign, as well as that of individual coalition members, and it brings together a diverse range of people and organizations and establishes an opportunity to engage and mobilize different constituencies. I know that's a run-on, but y'all bear with me. And there are a number of challenges, but one that I think is particularly relevant to this discussion, and one that many of us have had to deal with in our effort to reform the justice system, is the fact that we may be required to compromise our position on issues or tactics in order to make progress, and we will probably have to engage unlikely allies. I'm suggesting there's a publication that was released back in 2011 by an organization called the Constitutional Project, and they released it was a manual, talks about engaging unlikely allies to achieve criminal justice reform. And I think it's a good source for folks to go to look at if they haven't looked at it, because it's not easy to work in coalition. It takes work, it takes commitment, and a vision for what the end goal will be. And so that's just to set the frame to kind of let you know how we want to move this conversation along. I'm going to start with Mary, and she has a short video, and then I have some questions for her about a particular campaign that they have right now.
So thanks a lot. I'm really, really honored and excited to be on this panel. When I heard about the subject matter, I got even more excited because I thought FAMM, which actually you were right the first time, FAMM is now just FAMM.
Oh.
Yes, we just shed Families Against Mandatory Minimums. We didn't shed FAMM because at our heart are our families and our members who are incarcerated, but Families Against Mandatory Minimums doesn't talk about everything that we're doing now and doesn't express the breadth of our work. And it was a little awkward, so it's okay. But thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to explain that a few times anyway. Anyway, I wanted to share, as you said, I wanted to share a story about advocacy, about reaching across aisles, a success story actually from my own home state of Maryland that involved significant reforms in Maryland, including the elimination of drug mandatory minimums and a number of other things through the Justice Reinvestment Act. I expect a lot of you know about Justice Reinvestment, but it would not have been possible in Maryland without a right-left meeting of the minds. And I would tell you this story, but actually I'm going to show you this video because the lawmakers do a much better job and more entertaining job than I would of sort of explaining how far apart they were and how close together they came, if I can make this work. Thank you.
Hi, this is Kevin Ring with FAMM. We're here today in Annapolis, Maryland, because Governor Hogan just signed a major criminal justice reform bill. Two of the lawmakers who put the bill together disagree on just about every other issue, but we're able to find common ground on sentencing reform. We want to talk to them and see how they were able to pull off this compromise.
I'm Delegate Eric Barron, and I represent Prince George's County.
State Senator Michael Huff, Frederick and Carroll counties.
Who did you support for president in the Maryland primary?
I supported Hillary Clinton.
I supported Ted Cruz, and I was Ted Cruz's state chairman.
Do you support or oppose gun control?
I support reasonable gun control for public safety.
I'm 100% NRA A+ rated.
How would you rate the job that President Obama has done on a scale of 1 to 10?
8 or 9,
Why do you say that?
because I think he's done a good job overall.
I can't think of almost a single thing I agree with him on, so I guess I'll give him a 0.5 out of 10.
What would you say are the most important features of the Justice Reinvestment Act that you helped negotiate and that Governor Hogan signed?
We took people that we are in society that we're scared of, the murderers, the violent, bad offenders, and we actually put them away for longer. While people that we're mad at, people that are drug offenders, people that are running into problems with the law, a lot of times driven by addiction, we cut a new path for those folks.
What about those who say that drug dealing and drug trafficking is inherently violent?
Well, what we've done is we've put judges in a position to distinguish who the real bad guys are and who the people are who need some help. With this bill, we can focus on getting treatment for the people that we've found that need some help and not treat everyone with the same brush.
You know what the critics will say. If you don't have mandatory minimums, you're going to have soft on crime judges let prisoners out with a slap on the wrist. Are you soft on crime all of a sudden?
I am definitely not soft on a crime, but one of the things that we saw, mandatory minimums, not everyone was getting the mandatory minimums. Basically, the people that didn't take the pleas were getting the mandatory minimums. The people that take the plea and get out of it were the ones who weren't getting it. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a mandatory minimum, you're locking up the worst of the worst.
Now you're seeing conservative Republicans like Senator Huff support this issue. Do you think they're just interested in saving a buck?
Well, you know what? I don't really care what exactly motivates them. So long as they come to the table, and if they're at the table, then I feel like there's a chance for compromise. It's a chance for us to move forward.
Tell me why this isn't political suicide, right? So we know mandatory minimums don't make us safer, but doesn't voting for them make you safer? Isn't it easier to say, I'm tough on crime, I voted for mandatory minimums?
If you want to be a leader and you want to make changes, then you have to be able to explain to voters what you did. So this isn't like in the 80s or 90s where you had crack and these other things that were, in Baltimore and DC, but they hadn't heard of them. It wasn't a big deal in Frederick County. In Frederick County, we have a massive heroin problem. And the fact that this Justice Reinvestment will do more for drug treatment and puts more in drug treatment than any other bill in the history of the state of Maryland. So for me, that's something I'm very proud of. I think we need to give voters credit, explain to them what we're doing.
Yeah. So I can't take any credit for that. Let my boss and the lawmakers talk for us. But I think today, right-left collaboration is not as remarkable as it was in the past. I mean, we still talk about it. A lot of work has gone into it. I mean, I don't think too many people even bat an eye now when we hear from Senator Grassley fighting his own party to guarantee and try to ensure that sentencing reform is included in any criminal justice reform measure, right? He's fighting for mandatory minimum reform. You wouldn't have, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined that. It's not always been the case, and you can bet there's a backstory to that. There's a backstory that involves advocates and dedicated people working and walking into offices that they thought would always shut the door on them. The work that led to the reforms in Maryland also had a history, and these are reforms that are promising significant benefits for people facing the criminal justice system now, but it was certainly due to the work of advocates, as Toni referenced earlier.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about the campaign to promote a safety valve for mandatory minimums and what you all did to adopt a model that can be used in other states? Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. You've heard about gateway drugs. There's also gateway legislation, and some sense in which we think about safety valve reform in Maryland as a gateway. So years before Justice Reinvestment that you just saw discussed on this video was adopted, there was an effort to try and promote a safety valve in Maryland. In 2011, 2012, FAMM began kicking around the idea of broadening our outreach to conservatives and Republicans. We knew our issue, mandatory minimums, was not going to get a lot of traction if we weren't able to bring on conservatives to support that effort and to begin to change their minds about things. So we began to look around at lawmakers and think tanks and policymakers, and one of the groups that really interested us was the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC, which is pretty controversial in some circles, in many circles, one of the things that it does is it brings together private sector and public sector stakeholders to develop model legislation. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if there was model legislation about mandatory minimums or something like that? And so we were beginning to think about doing some outreach in that direction. At the same time and simultaneously, ALEC was sort of looking at its own criminal justice platform, which there wasn't very much, I think, at the time. And they simultaneously began to create the Criminal Justice Reform Task Force, which included private sector and public sector sort of components. And they reached out to us and asked if we wanted to be a part of the private sector. And we said, yes, we do. We wanted to be at that table. We wanted to think about how to get model legislation, if not to repeal mandatory minimums, which was going to be a pretty big stretch, perhaps to do something short of that. And so what we did was to promote the idea of a safety valve. Now, I'll just say, I mean, you probably already know what a safety valve is, but when there are mandatory minimums, some jurisdictions have adopted safety valves, and what the safety valve does is allow a judge to waive a mandatory minimum if certain conditions are met. So for example, at the federal level, a safety valve was passed a number of years ago. It's very narrow, it only covers drug offenders, and they have to meet like 5 specific criteria, but it was actually a Republican, it was supported by both parties. In Florida, in contrast, there's a rather broad safety valve that covers hit and run situations, hit and run convictions, right. Yeah, don't ask me more about it, but there it is. And then we had been working with other lawmakers. Rand Paul had introduced a federal Justice Safety Valve Act, which was quite broad, kind of an interest of justice one. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if there was model legislation and states began to look at ameliorating some of the impacts of their mandatory minimums with safety valves. So we and others, we aren't the only responsible parties here, but we and others worked and worked and worked within that task force. And in August of 2013, ALEC adopted model safety valve language. And what this means is that they adopted language that the members of ALEC and state lawmakers could look to if they wanted to do something about mandatory minimums. The safety valve says that with certain exceptions, like for crimes of violence or for sexual crimes against children, the safety valve provides judges discretion to avoid imposing the mandatory minimum if imposing it would result in a substantial injustice, and the mandatory minimum was not necessary to promote and protect public safety.
So, Mayor, can I ask you a question? Because one thing that was fascinating to me about that story and the fact that they worked with ALEC, how many of you have watched the documentary 13th and have probably heard about the evil, the evil giant? And so immediately what came to my mind was whether or not, even at that time when that opportunity came to be, did you all hesitate? Did you have any fear about your members accusing you of selling out for the cause? So I think, because that's an issue that a lot of us now have to grapple with now that there's, when you say bipartisan and different sides, often even sitting at a table that people that for decades have been your opposition, it's a little difficult.
Of course, it gave us pause, and we thought carefully. But remember who our membership is. Our membership is 40,000 people incarcerated in federal prison, others unnumbered incarcerated in state prisons, and their loved ones. We wanted to get something done, and we said, we're going to have to walk into the room and talk to the people who might be able to make this happen. And I think it helped because that was in 2013. One of the people who was involved in ALEC at the time and was a member of ALEC and also a staff member was Michael Huff, who you just saw on the video. without our even knowing about it, Senator Huff, who's a Republican from Frederick and Carroll counties, teamed up with a delegate named Kurt Anderson from Baltimore. And together, they championed a safety valve in Maryland. Now remember, this was before H.I.R.E, so I'm taking you a little bit back in time. Mm-hmm. They championed a safety valve in Maryland. It passed overwhelmingly. And so what happened is that for a year, judges had the ability to avoid imposing a mandatory minimum in Maryland. So then, but it wasn't made retroactive, all right? Then H.I.R.E passes, mm-hmm. right? And they eliminate mandatory minimums. And you think, okay, so the safety valve is obsolete, but it's not. Because the other thing that they guaranteed and they did in this bill was to make sure that that safety valve itself was made retroactive. So I'm doing circles within circles, but what this means is that Maryland lawmakers, right and left, Republicans and Democrats, said that people who got left behind by mandatory minimum reform have now, hundreds of them are now petitioning the courts to have their sentences reconsidered as if the safety valve were available to that judge. And that's what's happening right now. They have a year until September of this year, I think. And the Maryland Public Defender, I have some statistics, but the Maryland Public Defender is representing a lot of those individuals in those reconsideration motions.
Thank you, that's fantastic. And I think it tells the story that we have to begin to be very thoughtful about not continuing to preach to the choir. Yes, we can come together and lift each other up, kumbaya, chant, all of that, and strategize, but we have to think about ways that we can build our coalition to be broader, wider, and have diverse voices at the table, and invite different voices in our work. Ngozi, I want to turn to you. So can you talk a little bit about what the NAACP strategy around building a grassroots movement around addressing the issues of disparities that exist with the African American community and other populations of color in the legal system, and who has NAACP engaged nationally, with the field office work in building out this movement?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I will say, so I've been at the association for over 2 years now, coming from Ohio and doing state litigation and policy work there. So I want to recognize how many of the people in this room who have been doing this work from inside or outside prison walls for decades. I want to recognize that, I'm walking in the footsteps of giants. So I speak my wisdom here for you to, but I think I want to say that when being with the NAACP, recognizing that our strength is not about 100 people that we have on staff in our national office. It's really about the over 2,000 units that are out in the field. I think there are 5 branches here in Metro Atlanta area, but the ones that are in the tiny places in Saraland, Alabama, or so we have the east boroughs of Pittsburgh. So we have kind of the philosophy, and especially because we have a new president CEO as of last year, and really the philosophy is about looking at how all things are local and strengthening people on the local level. And that is so crucial. And as we know, as we've had these conversations about the world we live in today, where we are not getting the type of White House leadership, although it's interesting that there's conversations going on here, so we'll see what happens, but where we don't see that we can count on a sympathetic White House for civil rights protections, that a lot of the work that has to be done is done state and local level, and I think we have always recognized that, and I think that's a big priority. So I think the biggest answer for what do we do is that we actually give our branches, our state conferences, our youth councils, our prison branches, our college chapters, the tools to be effective advocates on the ground through their lived experience that they're working and reacting to, but with the tools that we can provide. I wanted to also talk about kind of the idea, the challenge, and the opportunity of this coalition work, because I think that it is there's some amazing opportunities, but there is a lot in the way that we do coalitions and the way that I have seen coalitions done that is really scary.
Tell the truth. This is the truth panel.
I'm just saying, you said I could say what I need to say. So, I think it is really funny because for me, when I come into a room as the NAACP, it's in our name, right? Like that we're talking about race, but I have gone into rooms where people were not ready to talk about race. And I'm just like, how are we talking about criminal justice reform? And I've, reviewed all your materials, and there is not a single word about how this is affecting Black communities. What is wrong, And I'm not saying that, so I think that in this room, it can be easy to think that people have gotten the memo, that we all got it. The Republicans, the Democrats, everybody gets it. They're on our side. We need to go new era. We're not there.
Yes.
And it's not. But it's not also our traditional enemies or our traditional friends, right? Who are either showing up or not showing up as expected. So I will say that I was really excited when you started to start with the, we are not taking race off the table. I mean, that's like a first and fundamental principle that if you cannot deal with what the criminal justice system, one, has been designed to do along racial lines and isn't in fact successfully doing along racial lines, then we have to have some conversations about that. But I think a second piece is about being really clear about what the intersection of what we can agree on when we can't agree on much. Because I think that there is sometimes the temptation to be really fuzzy, because once we start getting concrete about things other than this particular sentence in bill language, that suddenly we're going to have some arguments. Like, we need to be ready to have some arguments with the folks that are our coalition partners, because without that, we're going to pretend like we're all more on the same page than we actually are, and that, I think that causes problems down the road, because suddenly you said what? Like, we completely disagree with this, but you need to actually flesh that out. I will also say that it has been really important to raise the stakes for what what we are going to be holding our elected officials accountable for. I think we've gotten to, in some ways, we've gotten to this point where people are less afraid of being in trouble with their voters because they're seen as soft on crime in some ways. We have, Mr. Trump and Mr. Sessions to thank for being a little bit further behind that than we were. But I think that raising the stakes to say, if you are going to continue to pursue these policies and legislation that are just sucking the blood out of our communities, you will pay at the polls for this, and we will not forget. And so I don't think I'm a violent person, but I'm just saying, like,
the violence of the pen and the button. Yes. That's what it is.
You all caught me on a reflective and maybe truth-telling day, so sorry.
That's what I wanted.
And then a big piece for me is what's next. You know, when we can talk today and probably for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, about how little economic sense it makes to continue down this mass incarceration path that we still are on, right? We've made some gains, but I mean, in the big picture, we have, we have ways to go, right? Before somebody can make some type of argument that this type of incarceration, correctional control, is actually the good economic argument. But I guess having talked to a lot of people about the dollars and cents and how what we're doing doesn't make sense, I am concerned about what happens once we are not able to look at the balance sheet as much, right? When we kind of commodify our human rights consistently in our language, in the way that we shape our message, what next? So I think we have to be thinking about the short to medium term games that we need to get, which are going to still be in this world of really messed up economics. But I do want to make sure that we are still keeping prominent the big pictures that are the personal stories of people whose lives and communities are affected by this. So that was a really long story to what is the NAACP doing, but
Yeah. Well, you set us up nicely to transition to Dr. Pryor, Mr. Divine. I want you to talk about NuLeadership, obviously, and how you all have been building a transformational framework to redesign criminal justice to be human justice, which is what I think Teresa alluded to this morning when talking about like where we're trying to get to in terms of treating people as people from every part of their lives. And so I want you to kind of pick up from there and take us to where we need to be. That's all I have to give them. That's the only direction I have to give
The question
them.
is, do we have that kind of time? Okay,
You got
I'm
a
going to
little
attempt
bit
to
of
be.
time, not much. I want to leave time for questions, so.
Okay, I'm
you
going
can
to
make it
attempt to
like
be
10, 15
succinct.
minutes.
First, I certainly want to thank the NACDL for extending an invitation, in particular to Angeline for just continuing to move forward and stay in the path. Certainly, she's a warrior, and we certainly want to acknowledge and recognize her. Year after year, she has allowed me to come here and cause a disruption, so there's no need for me to disappoint her this year. So I of course, think that, some change is good and any change is good. I think that, the reforms that we're seeing around the nation are good steps. They're little steps. But I think that at the pace that we're going, it will be at least 3 or 4 more generations before we actually start seeing the results.
That's right.
What you actually see is only the tip of the iceberg. And I'll use a little analogy, and then I'll end up talking about some kind of solutions to it. So let's assume that crime was like tuberculosis. And let's say that there was an infection of TB in the community. We call it crime. And so what we do from a public health perspective, we attempt to identify those individuals who have been infected, right? And we quarantine them, right? We take them into the institution. We apply that to crime. People who have committed crime, we take them into an institution. And supposedly, we work on them. We correct them. All correction officers have MSWs. Y'all know that. They all hold PhD. That's why it's a correctional facility, because they're correcting allegedly bad behavior. Y'all get it so far. So they bring them in and they correct the behavior. Then they go back out. They're released at some point. And what happens? They get reinfected. They get rearrested. So they come back. So we go through the process and we correct them again, and then they go back out, and what happens? They get rearrested. So after a few times, one might say to herself, if I keep correcting the so-called behavior and the person goes out and they keep coming back, going back, coming back, at some point, I need to start asking some questions. Maybe I am doing a good job if I am in the institution, but perhaps there's something happening in the community. that I need to be addressing if I want to reduce recidivism. So the recidivism rate in this country has been about 60 to 70% for the last 3 or 4 decades. And it's just slightly gone down, but it's pretty much the same. And you might want to know in the 70s, a group of men in the Greenhaven Correctional Facility, one of which was my colleague and co-founder of the center, Eddie Ellis, produced a groundbreaking study with Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife. And basically the study said a lot of things, but for the most part it said that 75% of all the people in New York State prisons came from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. And that 65% of that 75% were people of color. I just want you to know that although it was done in New York, this applies to every state.
Anywhere. That's right.
The research has indicated that. And we know these communities that are supporting these prisons are also the same communities that have been historically neglected, have failing public school systems, substandard housing, poor quality health care, high rates of unemployment. You name it, it goes on and on. These same communities that are supporting the prisons. So we say, we now know what's happening and we know where it's happening. So as we begin to fix the problem, we have to understand that it's not just fixing individuals, that there are systems in place that have to be dismantled, that have to be disrupted, that have to be taken apart if we're really serious about it. Otherwise, if we don't, and we just go to work as usual and we do this little tiny reform here and tiny reform there, really what we're doing is perpetuating. We're consciously and voluntarily contributing to the incarceration, the mass incarceration of poor Black and brown communities all across America. That's the reality. And until we are brave enough and courageous enough to firsthand step up and recognize that the system is not broken. See, I was even guilty of this. For years and years, we rallied, the system is broken, the system is broken. And so they fixed the system. But when you fix a system that's broken, it operates more efficiently. So if the system is incarcerating people in mass and we're saying it's broken, we want it to be fixed, then it, in the fix, incarcerates more people because it's more proficient, more efficient. So the system's not broken. The system is operating exactly the way it was designed. And most of y'all said you saw 13th. So you already know then that there's legislation on the books, there's the Constitution of the United States, there's the 13th Amendment, all of which are various mechanisms that reinforce the enslavement of a particular group of people. This is not a coincidence. That's the reason why the vast majority of people that are in the prison system today are the great-great-great-grandsons and great-great-great-granddaughters of former slaves. And the same reason why slaves had difficulties integrating back into society after the emancipation, because they erected all kinds of barriers to prevent them from coming in. Y'all know what they were. Y'all know about all the voting laws and the vagrancy laws, and some of you may not.
The same laws we're still fighting.
That we're still fighting today.
Now.
You know, just imagine, right? You on the plantation, right? And you get the word that slavery's been abolished. So you say, okay, I'm free. And you pack your little bag and you get ready to go find your loved ones you've been separated from. And then the moment that you step off the plantation, you're arrested. You know why? Because the vagrancy law said that anyone who didn't have a place to live and was unemployed was breaking the law. So I can't step off. I have to stay on in order for me to be in compliance with the law. And then the voting rights law came in, one of the first ones, and said you can vote, but first, before you vote, you have to pass a literacy test. And if you took the test and you passed it, you were arrested. See, there's no way you could pass it if you just came out of slavery because it was against the law for a slave to read. So and then they had the Convict Lease Law. This was a good one. You know, Convict Lease Law was a law that said that if you were arrested and you were convicted, you could be leased back to the plantation, sometimes before your bed even got cold. So there was even a mechanism in place to ensure. Now, don't take my word for this. I would prefer you to walk away and say, oh, he's full of it. Go do the research yourself. And when you find out that all this is true, because I wouldn't come out on the national stage and say something that I didn't already know was a fact. When you go back and you find this to be true, you got to say, wow, what do we do about it? So this is what we do, and then I'll get out your way. What we first have to do is we have to get over it. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's painful. And I know that we don't have the best history, but history is what you make. History is not something that you stand on the sidelines and watch. History is something that you actively participate in. And even if the history wasn't the best, even if it wasn't good, we can make it good, we can make it better, and we can do it starting today. How do we do that?
That's right. That's right.
Y'all can clap.
That's
You
right.
we can start today. And I'm just going to give you some quick ones, and I'm going to turn it over because I know Toni wants to do questions, but very quickly, because I know that, we're scared, of people who did time in prison. They're scary people. They're very violent and all of these kind of stuff we conjure up. But let me tell you the best public safety plan for a person coming home from prison, employment. Let's just say Bobby comes home from prison, right? And you give him a job, and you give him probably a construction job because you want him to work real hard. And he works for 8 hours. You subtract 8 from 24, that leaves 16. It takes him an hour to go and an hour to come. Subtract 2 from 16, that gives you 14. And then he gets home, he's tired. He wants to rest for 8 hours, so you subtract that from 14, and what does that leave you? That only leaves you 6 hours. That means that Bobby only got 6 hours to wash his clothes, dry them, eat, prepare the food, do whatever. That means Johnny don't have time to do crime. Simply because he's employed. And then he's paying taxes, he's a consumer, he's purchasing things, and also you know where he's at for 8 hours of the day, at least. If you like accountability factor. Now, I'm just giving you a very simplified version, but I think you get the point that investing in people, not in systems, we can reform all the laws in the world, all the policies you want. If you don't invest in people, if you don't build people's capacity, if you don't build their potential, if you don't build their capability, you can have all the policies in the world and they go absolutely nowhere. And the reason being, because as these folks return back, and I don't have time to talk about why reentry to me is. Anyway, it's another question. When people go back to their communities, and those are the same communities that have been supporting the prison system for the last 4 or 5 decades, why would you think people would recidivate? There's no infrastructure there. The infrastructure has been undermined by mass incarceration. We've lost mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, neighbors, consumers. We've taken out the tax base, gerrymandering, so they're counted in other places, not in New York anymore, but in other places. So therefore, all the political power has been shifted. So economically, socially, psychologically, we've disrupted families. Why would you think that a person would recidivate? Why would we be surprised that it's about 70%? So I'm saying that we have to get serious and let's get real with it. And let's have this honest discussion. We got to talk about gender. We got to talk about race. We got to talk about the legacy of slavery. But then we can put that behind us and say, but we don't have to be imprisoned by our past. We don't have to let our past handcuff us. Yeah, it happened. It shouldn't have happened. And damn it, I'm not happy about it. But I want to move on and move past. But we're going to have to first have an honest discussion with each other. And I'm saying, get over it.
Okay.
And I have one thing to say. Two be real moments, right? So if we say that we have true coalitions, we should pick up on a couple of things that the doctor said. If you have a real criminal justice coalition, you need to be talking to them about disenfranchisement of people with felonies and ask them to get behind that, right? Or get behind enfranchising people. We have prison branches in Maine where the folks in that branch can vote and do voter registration drives every year, okay? Why is that not? There are only 2 states in the country, Maine and Vermont, where that can happen. Why is that not your priority if you actually really care about human beings in there? And then 2, about the convict leasing. We are right now in the middle of what will be one of the longest prison labor strikes, right?
Yes.
Because we are still doing the convict leasing thing, right?
Yes.
So let us support the people who are inside standing up for their rights.
We have a few minutes for maybe 2 questions, if anybody has. Come to the mic, please, quickly.
Hi, I'm Carrie Howard. I'm the public defender in Palm Beach County, Florida. So to me, I hear a little bit of a conflict in what you're saying. One is go for the things like the safety valve, right? Which is going to apply to first offenders. And what I'm seeing, because those things can be embraced, it actually increases the racial disparity in our criminal justice system. And as we're addressing reform, it is for the nonviolent, first offenders, no prior record. I'm seeing greater disparity today in the system than I saw 20 years ago because of what our history is. And I don't know how to undo that. So I'd love to hear suggestions as to how we undo what we're sort of stuck with, and the biggest being prior records,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I'd like to hear your
You
idea.
want to talk about the retroactivity?
I think the safety valve that was adopted by ALEC and ultimately passed in a somewhat different form in Maryland, actually a better form, wasn't limited to first offenders, but it was a small, reform. It wasn't everything we wanted, certainly. The people who were fighting for this weren't going to get everything they wanted. They recognized that, and the essence of coalition and struggle is that you sometimes have to give a few things up. I think the interesting thing for me about this journey in Maryland isn't so much that the safety valve was passed, but it was the beginning of that conversation, because Michael Huff, who ultimately steps up and does champions the Justice Reinvestment Act work, which was much more than mandatory minimums, as you all know, was that when he was working on the safety valve in Maryland a few years earlier, he was saying, look, this is not everything. This is not all those mandatory minimums. We're not going there right now. This is just one way for us to do a little bit of justice. And so it was a way to introduce the idea about the problems with a larger situation in Maryland. And then, of course, with funding from the Obama administration, they were able to just do a lot more. So I saw it as an interesting story about a product that then opened up a process that has then led to more reforms. And as I said, hundreds of people who otherwise would have been left behind are going to get out of prison. I don't know, and I have to think a little bit about this analysis in terms of reforms like that increasing racial disparity by making the system work more efficiently. And I haven't thought carefully about that, and I'd love to hear more, because that's a really important.
Right. I want to add that that's an analysis that we all have to continue to do as we're developing strategies around creating model legislation or whatever legislation we're fighting for. If you don't consider racial dynamics and how that plays out, and we saw that in many areas around addressing collateral consequences, when you don't look downstream and also look back at historical issues that come up that are centered around race, you can potentially find yourself in a place where you create more disparity potentially. So you really got to think about all of that, and think about this. It took us 400 years to get here. We're praying it don't take 400 years to undo all this. But there's a lot that has to be disentangled. And so if you're really thoughtful about developing your strategy and looking at what is really collecting the data that's necessary to analyze how things have gotten to where they are and what's the potential of what could happen based on different outcomes and lack of intent and operation of a particular law, you do yourself a disservice. So you really have to put in that time. The same way you fight, you have to put in strategizing around all the things that could potentially happen. Last question, Chris. Make it happen.
Thank you. Very quickly, I'm from Maryland. Well, I live in Maryland now as well. And Ngozi, we've talked on the phone. I didn't realize. Nice to meet you, because I'm the chair of criminal justice for the state conference, NAACP. So I'm looking at this picture, and we're trying to figure out how do we get past I heard the question. How do we deal with, we haven't talked about expungement in here yet.
Yeah.
In Maryland, unless I missed it, I'm sorry.
No, there's a panel that it will most likely definitely come up, the forgiveness panel that I know Margie Love is on.
Okay, and Margie came to testify for us
Yes.
in 2013. We now in Maryland have a nonviolent felony expungement law. Just got in last year. Of course, we still have to work on it because of what's known as the unit rule and the 15-year stipulation that they put on it. But nonetheless, we're so caught up in the imagery of who the boogeyman is. Mm-hmm. We don't want to forget. We don't want to let people go. We want to keep that shackle on these former slaves. We will not forgive because we want to relegate people to expungement is the breaking of the shackle. Now, some people, of course, everybody shouldn't be expunged. I understand it. But then there's shielding. There are methods of post-conviction relief that we can deal with if we allow our brains to go down that path.
Do you have a question?
Do you agree?
That's my life's work. So yes, I agree. And on that note, can you all please give our panel a hand? Thank you.